So we're going to get into our first of the primary organs for the endocrine system, looking at the hypothalamus along with its kind of partner, the pituitary gland. So we'll talk about their role in physiology and the relationship between the two. We'll talk about some of the hormones they produce, like oxytocin, ADH. We'll talk about some of the other hormones beyond just that, like human growth hormone, prolactin, luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, and adrenocorticotropic hormone, and kind of talk about all of those with this one. So this is a bit of a big one. The hypothalamus is going to have a pretty big job here, especially with the pituitary gland. You know, the interactions between the two are going to, for the most part, have a lot of control over the other endocrine organs. So let's talk about it. So the hypothalamus, right, is found in the brain. Right, if we look at where it is, we see it's kind of almost in the middle and like down on the like that posterior, on that inferior side. So it's kind of in that middle on that inferior side. And this is really our connection between the nervous and the endocrine system, right? So this is really what is linking those two systems together, is the hypothalamus. So here's the hypothalamus right in here. Kind of see this like almost like a triangle-like shape. And then hanging off of the hypothalamus, right, is going to be the pituitary. So this little kind of ball right here is the pituitary. There's two sides to it. We have an anterior side, which is this one you see more of in pink, and then a posterior side, which you see more in beige. And they're going to be connected to the hypothalamus through the infundibulum, which is this kind of stalk-like structure that connects the two of them. So the pituitary, sometimes called the hypophysis, I'm perfectly fine with you saying pituitary. That is a-okay with me, right? It has the two halves. All three of these pieces together are going to kind of serve as the overarching control of the endocrine system. Right, and we'll talk about some of the key pieces. We'll talk about what they do, right? How, you know, who's making what and how that's being regulated. So let's start with the posterior pituitary gland. So the posterior pituitary gland is the part of the pituitary that is in the back, right? Or the neurohypophysis, because it's actually going to be made of neural tissue. So the hypothalamus is going to make hormones. In particular, we're making oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, and then we're going to just send those down to the posterior pituitary. In this case, we're facing the other way, so our posterior is here, right? We flopped it, right? So that this is the front where my mouse is at right now. But we see that we have neurons that extend from the hypothalamus all the way down into the posterior pituitary. So we have like a channel, right? We have like a channel, a tract, right? Remember what tracts are. If you remember that from anatomy, tract versus nerve. Tracts are going to be the same thing as a nerve, except we are fully encapsulated in the central nervous system. And so that's why we have that name. But we have these neurosecretory cells. They're the ones that are going to make the oxytocin. They're making the ADH, and they're secreting it down into the posterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary, or the PP is what we have for short, right, is going to store and release ADH and oxytocin as needed. You may see ADH also called vasopressin. For sake of simplicity in this class, I'm going to use ADH, or the full name, antidiuretic hormone, but do keep in mind that you may see vasopressin elsewhere. But this, the posterior pituitary is really just doing that, right? It's going to be taking things made by the neurosecretory cells in the hypothalamus, oxytocin, ADH. We move through the hypothalamic hypophyseal tract, right? And then we're stored in the posterior pituitary for release later, right? And we see this capillary plexus, this capillary bed, where we can do that secreting and absorption in there. So let's kind of go step by step, right? So the hypothalamic neurons are the ones making the oxytocin or making the ADH. right? From there, those hypothalamic, hypophyseal tract neurons are going to basically serve as the pipeline for those hormones down to the posterior pituitary. We're going to store those in the axon terminals in the posterior pituitary. So this is how we're storing oxytocin and ADH in the posterior pituitary. It's going to hang out in the ends of those axons, at the very end of those neurons. And then when it's time to release them, we need to release oxytocin or we need to release ADH, then we will, an action potential will travel down, will basically cause us to release those two hormones, which will then be taken into the bloodstream and carried throughout the body. So it's kind of similar, right? If you have a little bit of an idea of how like neurotransmitters are secreted, we're kind of seeing the same thing, right? A bunch of vesicles with ADH and oxytocin at the end, and then we can release those into the space. They can then diffuse across into the capillaries to be carried offward into the rest of the body. So what does oxytocin do, right? We're talking about oxytocin and ADH, but what the heck do they do? So oxytocin, you may have heard of it called like the cuddle hormone. This is going to basically be something that can help us when someone is in childbirth, like they're going to have a baby. So when the baby, the fetus is pushing up against the cervix, this is going to cause stretching. That stretching is detected, right, by receptors, which then take that signal to the brain. Oxytocin is released in response in order to enhance and increase the frequency and strength of contractions. So that's what we mean by the gravid uterus. Like someone's actively, like they're in labor, right? And so oxytocin will help promote labor to continue. And this is a positive feedback mechanism. It's one of the rare instances of a positive feedback mechanism, and it's the one we usually talk about. But oxytocin is also going to be released in response to the suckling that baby will do after birth, right? So when a baby is breastfeeding, that suckling sensation is detected by receptors, which carry that signal to the brain, right, to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus then goes, okay, there is suckling. We need to release oxytocin to promote the stimulation of a milk, right? So stimulate milk being ejected. So it's not necessarily producing the milk, but it's promoting the release of that milk. We do use synthetic oxytocin to induce childbirth contractions. So if you've ever heard of someone being induced, we are giving them a synthetic version of this hormone to promote this process. But again, this slide right here, just talking about this is like one of your very few examples of positive feedback mechanism or a positive feedback loop. So this would be like the one that I would really expect you to remember because it's the one that we always talk about. Now, antidiuretic hormone, ADH or vasopressin, this is going to basically help us retain salt ions, so sodium ions and water. So it's going to stimulate us to reabsorb that in the kidneys, hence the name antidiuretic hormone. Anti, we think against. A diuretic, we think makes you urinate. So this is a hormone, right, that is going to help you retain water. So ADH, right, will basically decrease the urine volume because we're conserving water. We're trying to reclaim as much water from the urine as possible. This is what leads to urine being very concentrated, right? So if you don't have a lot of water and your body uses ADH to reclaim that water because you're getting dehydrated, you'll notice your urine gets more concentrated. It gets very yellow. So ADH is secreted, basically is controlled by the osmolality in the blood. So basically what is the concentration of things like water and the sodium ions and whatnot, like how much water do we have in the blood and whatnot. And this is going to be monitored by receptors called osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus, and this is a negative feedback loop, right? So if there is an increase in blood volume, right, meaning we have more water, the solutes are more diluted, we're not very dehydrated, like we're nice and hydrated, we don't need a lot of ADH. We can afford to lose some of that water, and we don't want to continually absorb water, reabsorb water, if we already are hydrated, right? Because overhydration is a problem too. So if blood volume is high, we're good. We don't need to reclaim that water. We can allow it to just be secreted. And so ADH secretion goes down because ADH would cause us to retain more water. But let's say we have not had water in a while, we're dehydrated, right? Our blood volume has gone down. There are more solutes in comparison to the water. We're dehydrated, we need that water. Or sorry, we need to reclaim water, which means we need ADH. And so we see ADH secretion increases, right? So blood volume's up, ADH secretion goes down. Blood volume's down, ADH secretion goes up. There is a condition called diabetes insipidus where ADH is not being produced appropriately, which means someone with diabetes insipidus may have lost their ability to do that last reabsorption of water from the kidneys. So they don't get to make that last reabsorption, which means they lose more water than the average person. So their urine stays more diluted and they're at a higher risk of dehydration, right? So they're going to feel dehydrated, they're going to feel thirsty, they're going to need to intake much more water than the average person. And they're also going to urinate a lot more too. So someone with diabetes insipidus, right, is going to produce lots of urine. They're going to have to urinate all the time. It's important not to confuse diabetes insipidus with the type 1, type 2 type diabetes that we'll get into later. Now let's talk about the anterior pituitary gland. This one kind of is a little bit more intense compared to the posterior, but the anterior lobe, sometimes called the adenophysis, I'm just going to call it the anterior lobe for you guys because that's what you've probably learned it as this whole time. It's going to produce and secrete its own different hormones in response to the hypothalamus kind of instructions. So the hypothalamus will release hormones that will trigger the anterior lobe to release or trigger the anterior lobe to inhibit the production and secretion of certain hormones. These hormones can be classified as tropic or non-tropic. So if it is tropic, it is going to act on a different endocrine organ. If it is non-tropic, then it's going to act on a non-endocrine target organ. So somatotrophs, this is going to be for growth hormone on somatic cells, hence the name somato, right? So that's going to be just working on body cells, right, for general growth like muscle and bone and whatnot. And since those are not endocrine organs primarily, then we would call it a non-tropic hormone. Lactotroph secretes prolactin. This is to increase the production of milk. And so the mammary glands would be the target there. They're not going to be an endocrine organ either, so it is also non-tropic. Whereas the thyrotroph, the corticotroph, and the gonadotroph cells are all producing hormones that are tropic because they're acting on target organs from the endocrine system. Thyrotroph will secrete thyroid stimulating hormone, hence the name, which acts on the thyroid. Corticotroph cells are going to secrete adrenocorticotropic hormone, which acts on the adrenal cortex, hence the name adrenocortico, right? And then gonadotroph cells secrete two different hormones, the follicle stimulating hormone and the luteinizing hormone, which acts on the gonads. So the names alone of these different types of cells kind of tells you what the target is, right? Somato, lacto, thyro, cortico, and gonado. Those all tell you the target for the hormones produced by those cells. So there's a bunch of different hormones that the hypothalamus will release to basically control, to manage the anterior pituitary gland. We have 7 of them. It will either be a releasing hormone or an inhibiting hormone. So gonadotropic releasing hormone, right? Those two, that one will be to trigger the luteinizing and follicle stimulating hormone to stimulate the reproductive system. We have thyro releasing hormone. Again, these are all the releasing hormones to basically tell the anterior pituitary produce and secrete this hormone. So prolactin releasing hormone, um, growth hormone releasing hormone, corticotropic releasing hormone. These are all of them, you'll notice, have an R in the name because it's a releasing hormone, versus an IH, an inhibiting hormone, right, does the opposite. So the way I like to think of it is the hypothalamus is kind of acting like the big boss, right? It's the president, it's the one in charge, right? The CEO, whatever you want to call it, right? It's the one in charge of the endocrine system, right? Because it is going to be either producing the hormones or stimulating the production and secretion of the hormones that are stored / produced by the anterior and posterior pituitary glands. So the pituitary, both the anterior and posterior, kind of like the middle management. They still have some regulatory impact, right? Because they're going to be targeting other organs, including other endocrine organs. But the hypothalamus is really the one that is at the top, right? It's the big boss. I'll let you look at this slide. If you need to pause here and kind of read through it to take some notes, by all means, pause here for a little bit. Otherwise, I'm going to continue going on so that we can get to other things with the hypothalamus and pituitary. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about what the relationship between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland. So in this case, right, our hypothalamus is not producing hormones for storage, it's producing hormones to control, right, to communicate with the anterior pituitary. So we can either secrete a releasing hormone or an inhibiting hormone, right? It's going to go through what we call the primary capillary plexus, right, which we see it kind of coming down here. Here's our primary capillary plexus. Anytime you see that, right, you think capillaries, thin little blood vessels. Plexus, we think like this kind of network that we see here. So we're going to be sending those hormones into there. From there, we travel down through the portal veins to get to the anterior pituitary. And then that's where the anterior pituitary will kind of get that signal of, hey, you are to release this hormone, or you are to inhibit the release of this hormone. And then whatever the instructions are, the anterior pituitary will respond in such. So if it's being told, if we are getting a releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, then the anterior pituitary will be stimulated to produce and release that hormone into the secondary capillary plexus, which is down here. So we have the primary and the secondary capillary plexus. Primary, you think it's the first one. Secondary, it's towards the end, right? So primary is between the hypothalamus and pituitary. Secondary is between the pituitary and the rest of the body. So there is a relationship between the hypothalamus, the anterior pituitary, and the target gland. We call this an axis. So like the HPA, or the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, right? So we're kind of looking at the entire pathway that we travel. So if we look at this one, right, the hormone products coming from those adrenals, like cortisol, right, is going to help regulate through negative feedback inhibition. Sometimes this happens at the anterior pituitary level, right? Basically, we tell the anterior pituitary not to respond to the hypothalamic signals, or we can inhibit at the hypothalamus level, like all the way at the top, which means we inhibit the secretion of the releasing hormones. So two things can happen, right? The end product, right? So if we look at the picture here, we have the hypothalamus, which releases a releasing hormone, hormone 1. Anterior pituitary responds to that, producing and stimulating the release of hormone 2. Our target organ, which then produces the last hormone in this chain, which is hormone 3, and that hormone 3 can either, right, depending on the pathway, inhibit the anterior pituitary, which basically turns the anterior pituitary off from responding to the hypothalamus. It's like an ignore button, right, for the anterior pituitary. Or hormone 3 goes all the way to the top, right, and the hypothalamus detects that increase in the hormone 3 level and stops the release of hormone 1. So we can stop it in multiple places along this chain. It just depends on that particular pathway. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about some of these hormones. So we're going to look at human growth hormone. This is non-tropic because it is going to impact, or the target organs for this are going to be non-endocrine. This is from the somatotroph cells. Again, somato, we think body. So this is going to come in response to different signals. This is going to do things like stimulate the growth of things like muscles and bones, right? This is going to act on tissues to cause the secretion of insulin-like growth factors. Again, this is for growth, for the use of lipids, right? Lipolysis. This is going to help increase metabolism or change, I shouldn't say increase, but change metabolism, right? How things are being metabolized. Human growth hormone releasing hormone. I know it's a lot in the name. Growth hormone releasing hormone is going to control human growth hormone secretion. We also have growth hormone inhibiting hormone, which does the exact opposite. It's going to inhibit the production and secretion of human growth hormone. So this is going to use a negative feedback loop because those insulin-like growth factors, they will basically, like we get enough of them, we've grown, right? We can then turn off that human growth hormone pathway, right, back on the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. So we can either shut down the production of growth hormone in the anterior pituitary, or we can shut down the release of GHRH, right, the releasing hormone in the hypothalamus. And then if we look up in these little bullet point lists that we see up in the figure, we see things that will either increase human growth hormones release or decrease it. So everything that you see there in the pink side on the left is going to increase it. So things like increased blood levels of amino acids, deep sleep, testosterone, thyroid hormones, right? These will increase the production/secretion of human growth hormone. Whereas on the other side, hyperglycemia, obesity, high levels of growth hormone, and insulin-like growth factors will decrease the secretion of human growth hormone. So we get these bursts, right? It's not like a continuous thing. It depends on what we're doing, what's going on, what age are we, right? Those things will help change this even from a day-to-day level. And there's a couple disorders that come from changes in the amount of growth hormone available. So if you have an underproduction, right, hyposecretion of human growth hormone, then this can cause pituitary dwarfism. So the person with pituitary dwarfism will still have it'll have a proportionate form or cause a proportionate form of dwarfism. So that person will just be smaller overall, but they'll still maintain the proportions, right? So like their head, their arms, their legs, right? Those will still be in proper proportions or normal proportions. They'll just be smaller, right? Versus gigantism or acromegaly, this is the hypersecretion of human growth hormone. Gigantism is going to come from this hypersecretion in childhood, whereas acromegaly is going to come from overproduction after puberty in adulthood. So I'm not going to go too crazy with prolactin right now, but prolactin is non-tropic in that it's going to be acting, those lactotroph cells are going to be working on the mammary glands to produce milk, and that we know that when it comes to the oxytocin, the prolactin milk production and ejection of that milk is going to be positively stimulated by the suckling of an infant. And so this is, again, one of our rare positive feedback loops that we see. Next, we have luteinizing and follicle stimulating hormones. These are tropic hormones because we are now working on, our target is an endocrine organ, the gonads. So we release these by the gonadotroph cells in the anterior pituitary gland. Luteinizing hormone is going to work on the gonads, causing them to produce hormones. So like ovaries will produce estrogen, progesterone, testes will produce testosterone. Whereas follicle stimulating hormone will work on the gonads as well, but we're going to be working on follicle or like cell development, specifically gametes, eggs and sperm. So they're both going to work on the gonads, but just different things. Luteinizing hormone is going to focus on the gonad's ability to produce hormones. Follicle stimulating hormone will focus on the gonad's ability to produce gametes. So both of these are going to be promoted by gonadotropin releasing hormones from the hypothalamus, and we have negative feedback loops in place that are going to be regulated when we have high amounts of inhibin, estrogen, and testosterone. So when those ones become high, then we can act both on the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary to prevent the overproduction of luteinizing and follicle stimulating hormones. Next, we get to thyroid stimulating hormone, again tropic because we are working on an endocrine organ. These are coming from thyrotroph cells in the anterior pituitary, and they are going to promote the synthesis and secretion of T3 and T4. Again, we have like the thyroxine and triiodothyronine. I'm perfectly fine with you saying T3 and T4. So they're going to be, this hormone, TSH, is going to promote the secretion of T3 and T4. T3 and T4 are going to help with your general metabolism. So your bone, your muscle growth, lipolysis, energy use, right? And so this hormone basically is going to, or T3 and T4 are basically going to help control your baseline metabolism. TSH is going to be promoted by thyroid releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. And this is going to be, again, another negative feedback loop when T3 and T4 levels become high. So once you have enough T3 and T4, right, we can basically stop the hypothalamus from releasing TRH. We can stop the anterior pituitary from releasing TSH. So multiple places where we can regulate the thyroid's hormone production. Then we get to adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH. This again is tropic, hence the name. This is going to work on the adrenal cortex. Remember, the adrenal cortex is going to be responsible for producing and secreting things like cortisol, which are that's an example of a glucocorticoid, aldosterone, which is a mineral corticoid, and then androgens, DHEA, which will help with with production of other hormones, including testosterone and estrogen. It's important to note these androgens, we typically think male reproductive systems when we hear that term androgen, but it's important to note these are found in both men and women. So this is coming from CRH, right, which just, again, our corticotropic releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. This can be done in response to stress, it can be done in response to the circadian rhythm, and this is, again, a negative feedback loop. So if you have enough of these end products, right, we can act on the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary to shut down the production, right, or pause the production of these things like ACTH and CRH. Another one is melanin stimulating hormone. This is non-tropic. It's working on your melanocytes in your skin. MSH is going to be a derivative of your adrenocorticotropic hormone. It acts on your brain, promotes brain activity, but it also works on your melanocytes so that you can produce melanin. This hormone is going to be promoted by both the CRH and tanning. This is one of the reasons why someone with Addison's disease ends up getting a bronzing of the skin. You may have seen that with like JFK, right, who had Addison's and did have that bronzing. So I'm not going to read this to you because that's absolutely silly, but if you'd like to pause here, this would be a good table to kind of take a look at and get to know, especially knowing the hormones, their target tissues, and their principal actions. Those you most definitely need to know, but you also should have some understanding of the regulation. You know, what's going to inhibit it, what's going to stimulate it. So this table here would be nice and neat for you to be able to kind of summarize what's going on with the hypothalamus and pituitary.